The courthouse doors groaned open as the morning sun spilled across the marble floor. People shuffled in, their footsteps echoing against the high ceilings, whispers darting through the air like nervous birds. It was not an ordinary day in this small town. Trials happened often enough, but this one had pulled in people who had never set foot in a courtroom before. Shop owners closed early, mothers arranged childcare, and workers took personal days just to claim a seat on the creaking benches inside. Everyone wanted to see how justice would unfold. The defendant sat at the long wooden table, back rigid, jaw locked tight. He wore a simple navy suit that seemed borrowed rather than owned, the sleeves just a touch too short for his arms. His expression was unreadable, half defiance, half exhaustion, but his eyes betrayed him, darting toward the jury every few moments, as though searching for sympathy. Behind him, family members sat huddled together, their faces pale but proud, trying to project confidence. On the opposite side of the room, the prosecution team arranged their papers in neat, sharp stacks. Every movement was purposeful, designed to project control. The lead prosecutor, a tall woman with steely eyes, exuded calm authority. Her pen tapped rhythmically against the folder before her, each click echoing like a countdown to the storm about to break. At the center of it all sat the judge, elevated above the fray in a chair that seemed both throne and anchor. His black robes hung loose, his silver hair combed back neatly. He scanned the courtroom with an expression of practiced neutrality, though his eyes lingered a moment too long on the crowd. He knew what they all wanted: a story, a verdict, a conclusion that would justify their curiosity. But he also knew justice was rarely so clean. Beneath his bench, almost invisible in its stillness, rested a German Shepherd Police K9. The animal lay beside its handler, ears perked, eyes bright. Its presence was not unusual. Many officers relied on K9s during investigations, but in this case, the dog was not merely a silent companion. It was part of the evidence, a living link to the night in question. To some, the dog represented loyalty, courage, and proof of the law's reach. To others, it symbolized intimidation and fear. Whatever the perspective, no one in the courtroom ignored its presence for long. The jurors filed in, 12 men and women carrying the weight of the town's expectations on their shoulders. Some looked uneasy, tugging at collars or smoothing skirts. Others projected confidence, though their eyes darted nervously to the defendant, then to the K9, then back again. They knew they had been chosen, not only for fairness, but for resilience. The trial ahead promised days, perhaps weeks, of relentless testimony and evidence. The bailiff's voice boomed, calling the court to order. The room fell into silence, the kind that felt less like peace and more like the pause before thunder. Everyone rose, wooden benches creaking, as the judge cleared his throat and began. This court is now in session. The opening statements unfolded with careful precision. The prosecutor painted a picture of events that night: the crime, the chase, the arrest. She spoke of bravery, of justice, of the community's right to safety. Every sentence struck like a hammer against stone, laying a foundation for her case. She glanced toward the K9 more than once, as if the dog's quiet posture reinforced every word she said. The defense attorney rose in response, shorter and less commanding in presence, but sharp in wit. He reminded the jury that appearances could deceive, that justice required skepticism, that the state's narrative was only one version of the truth. He pointed toward his client with deliberate slowness. This man is not the monster you've been led to believe. He is a father, a brother, a son. He deserves the same presumption of innocence as anyone sitting here. The defendant did not flinch. He kept his eyes forward, lips pressed into a hard line. But his fingers tapped against the table, betraying the storm within. The crowd shifted uneasily, some nodding with the defense's plea, others rolling their eyes in disbelief. Everyone had already formed their own verdict in the court of public opinion, and it clashed now with the duty of listening impartially. The morning wore on, filled with the drone of legal arguments, objections, and rulings. Witnesses were sworn in, their testimonies weaving a fabric of half-truths and memories. The canine remained steady, watching silently, its chest rising and falling with measured breath. A few times, the dog's ears flicked as voices rose, reminding everyone that this trial was not only about paperwork and words. It was about something raw, something primal. In the back row, a mother hushed her child, who fidgeted with impatience. A reporter's pen scratched furiously, pausing only when the gavel struck for order. A juror bit his lip so hard it nearly bled, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the task before him. By midday, the courtroom had settled into a rhythm. Question, answer, objection, sustain, overrule. The judge's voice became metronomic, the attorney's strategies unfolding like rehearsed theater. Yet underneath the routine beat a steady undercurrent of unease. No one could shake the feeling that the trial was building towards something unpredictable. The dog shifted at one point, a subtle movement that nevertheless drew the eyes of several jurors. It lifted its head, amber eyes catching the light, and for a heartbeat the room stilled. It was as if the animal sensed what the humans could not. The tension, the fear, the truth waiting just beyond reach. The handler gave a slight tug on the leash, and the moment passed, but it lingered in the minds of those who had seen it. By the time recess was called, the crowd exhaled collectively, as though they had been holding their breath since the morning. People stood, stretching stiff backs and whispering furiously to one another. Outside, the air felt fresher, though. The weight of the proceedings clung to everyone like a second skin. Inside, however, the courtroom remained heavy with silence. The defendant leaned toward his attorney, whispering urgently, his hands moving in sharp gestures. Across the aisle, the prosecutor reread her notes, underlining key points with a steady hand. The judge retreated to chambers, leaving behind an empty chair that still radiated authority. And at the front, the dog lowered its head onto its paws once more, patient, waiting. The trial had only just begun, yet already it had claimed the town's full attention. The story would be long, filled with twists and revelations, but no one could deny the gravity of that first day. It was not just about evidence or law. It was about people, about trust, about fear, and about the silent animal that seemed to embody all three. For now, the courthouse stood as both stage and battleground. And though no one knew it yet, a moment was coming, innocent, unexpected, that would freeze the entire room and etch itself forever in their memory. The heavy courtroom doors creaked open just as the prosecutor began calling her next witness. Heads turned in unison, curiosity pulling the crowd's attention from the stand to the back of the chamber. The interruption was unusual enough, but what startled most was the sight of the young woman stepping cautiously through the threshold. She looked out of place in the sea of tailored suits and polished shoes, a mother balancing the delicate weight of her 2-year-old daughter on her hip. A hush rippled across the benches. Mothers rarely brought children into courtrooms, let alone toddlers who could scarcely sit still through a prayer, much less the heavy proceedings of a criminal trial. Yet there she was, slender, weary, her eyes betraying sleepless nights. Her dark hair was pulled back into a loose braid, strands falling into her face as she clutched her little girl close. The child's cheeks were flushed, one hand clutching a stuffed rabbit, so worn its ear hung by a single stitch. The bailiff stepped forward, instinctively protective of the courtroom's order, but the judge raised a hand, halting him. His brow furrowed as he leaned forward on the bench. He had seen all manner of witnesses in his years, nervous neighbors, hardened officers, grieving relatives, but the sight of a mother and toddler walking toward the stand was something else entirely. He motioned for her to proceed. The mother's shoes clicked softly against the tile as she made her way to the front. She shifted the toddler in her arms, murmuring reassurance into the girl's ear. The child's eyes were wide, scanning the room with innocent curiosity. The polished wood, the stern faces, the imposing black robes, none of it seemed to intimidate her. Instead, her gaze flitted from person to person, absorbing the scene the way children do, without filter, without context, but with startling clarity. Gasps and whispers spread through the benches. Some leaned toward one another, whispering theories. Why would they bring a child here? What role could she possibly play? Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, recognizing the unusual moment as a headline waiting to be printed. The jurors shifted, some looking uncomfortable, others intrigued. The judge cleared his throat. "State your name for the record," he said, his voice carrying the usual gravity, though softened with a note of caution. The mother adjusted her hold on the child and spoke, her voice steady, though quiet. She gave her name, her occupation, her connection to the events of the case. The defense attorney studied her intently, pen poised above his legal pad, searching for weaknesses in her tone, her story, her demeanor, all the while. The toddler squirmed. She tugged at her mother's necklace, tapped her tiny shoes against the wooden platform, and craned her neck to peer at the German shepherd lying obediently at its handler's feet. The dog's presence seemed to draw her attention in a way nothing else did. The prosecutor began her questioning. Her tone was careful, measured, as if afraid a sharp edge might shatter the fragile scene. She asked the mother about where she had been that night, what she had seen, what she remembered. The woman answered as best she could, glancing down at her daughter when the weight of memory threatened to overwhelm her. The child fidgeted again, letting out a soft hum that drew a few chuckles from the gallery. Even in a room thick with tension, the innocence of a toddler was disarming. The judge offered a faint smile, allowing the moment to pass without reprimand. The jurors, too, softened, their shoulders easing as the girl adjusted her grip on the stuffed rabbit and rested her head briefly against her mother's shoulder. Yet beneath the warmth of the moment lingered unease. It wasn't just the novelty of a child in the courtroom. It was the question that hung silently in the air. Why? Why had the prosecution chosen to allow this? What role could such a small child play in unraveling the truth of the night in question? The defense attorney finally stood, his voice sharp enough to slice through the gentle rhythm of testimony. "Your Honor, is it appropriate to have a minor, particularly one so young, in this courtroom?" The jury may be swayed more by sympathy than facts. The judge regarded him coolly. The child is not being called as a witness. She is here only because her mother was subpoenaed. Unless she disrupts the proceedings, she may remain. The defense attorney opened his mouth to argue further, then thought better of it. He sat, though not without a pointed glance at the jury, planting seeds of doubt in their minds. The mother's testimony continued, weaving details of the evening, the shouts, the confusion, the sudden appearance of officers. Her voice trembled when she described the moment the K-9 entered the scene, how quickly events spiraled afterward. She did not embellish, did not speculate, only recounted what she had seen. Still, her words painted a picture heavy with implication. As she spoke, the toddler wriggled once more, this time leaning forward, eyes fixed firmly on the police dog at the handler's side. The animal, sensing her gaze, lifted its head. For a moment, child and dog locked eyes across the courtroom. The girl tilted her head, studying the creature with an intensity that belied her age. The murmurs in the gallery quieted again, as though some shared instinct told everyone to pay attention. The prosecutor noticed the shift but pressed on, unwilling to lose momentum. She guided the mother through the testimony, carefully avoiding leading questions, building her case brick by brick. Yet even as the words filled the air, the real weight of the moment seemed to gather in the toddler's still gaze. The judge shifted in his chair. The jurors leaned forward. Even the defendant, who had spent much of the day staring blankly ahead, turned to look at the child. She was no official witness, no sworn participant in the machinery of justice, yet the air bent around her as though she carried a truth unspoken. The mother, perhaps sensing the collective gaze, hugged her daughter closer, brushing a kiss against her temple. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The child blinked, her expression unreadable, then turned back toward the stuffed rabbit in her lap, hugging it tight. For a moment, the tension lifted, replaced by the simple tenderness of a parent and child. But those who had seen the girls' lingering look toward the canine could not shake the image. Innocence and experience had brushed against one another, and the effect was unsettling. When the testimony concluded, the prosecutor thanked the mother and excused her from the stand. She rose carefully, balancing her daughter's small weight as she stepped down. The gallery watched her walk back through the aisle, whispers following her like shadows. The judge called for a recess, his gavel striking once, the sound reverberating through the chamber. The jurors were let out, the attorneys gathered there. Notes, and the crowd spilled into the hallway, buzzing with speculation. But the moment lingered in the air, long after the mother and child had gone. No one could have known then that the little girl's presence, innocent, unassuming, uninvited, would become the pivot around which the trial would turn. No one could have predicted that her gaze, her gesture, and eventually her words would freeze the courtroom in a way evidence and testimony never could. For now, she was just a child in her mother's arms. But the story had already begun to bend toward her, inexorably, like iron filings to a hidden magnet. The German shepherd lay at the edge of the courtroom, like a shadow carved into the floor. At first glance, it seemed almost ornamental, a decorative symbol of authority brought in to remind everyone of the long arm of law enforcement. Yet those who had spent more time around trained police dogs knew better. Every measured breath, every subtle twitch of muscle beneath the sleek coat carried meaning. This animal was not here by accident. It was evidence, presence, and warning all wrapped into one. The handler sat upright beside the dog, his posture military straight, his hand resting lightly on the leash. He had said little throughout the proceedings, offering only the occasional nod when addressed. But his eyes rarely left the shepherd, watching for the smallest shift, the faintest signal. Years of partnership had created a language between them, silent and precise. To the handler, the dog was not simply a tool. It was an extension of himself, a partner who had stood with him through situations most civilians could hardly imagine. To the jury, though, the animal was something else entirely. Some regarded it with admiration, comforted by its steadiness and reputation for loyalty. Others looked uneasy, their gazes darting quickly away whenever the shepherd lifted its head. Its amber eyes, sharp and unblinking, seemed capable of peeling back layers of composure. And somewhere in the back rows of the gallery, more than one pair of eyes lingered with quiet suspicion, remembering whispered stories about the night of the arrest. The courtroom was alive with words, questions, objections, testimonies. But the dog existed outside of that noise. While lawyers sparred over technicalities, the shepherd's ears flicked toward every sound, cataloging, assessing. A shuffle in the gallery, the scrape of a chair leg, the nervous clearing of a throat. Nothing escaped its attention. It was discipline given form, a living emblem of control, yet beneath the surface pulsed something older, something primal. The toddler noticed, while her mother shifted in the witness chair, voice trembling under the prosecutor's gentle guidance. The child's gaze kept returning to the animal. She leaned forward, clutching her stuffed rabbit tighter, her eyes round with curiosity. Unlike the adults, she had no practiced filters, no rehearsed masks of neutrality. To her, the shepherd wasn't a badge of law or a piece of evidence. It was simply a dog, though not one that invited playful giggles or outstretched hands. The dog's head lifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, when the girl's gaze lingered too long. Their eyes met across the room, and for the briefest moment, something unspoken passed between them. The toddler tilted her head, as though trying to understand, her lips parting slightly. Then she nestled closer to her mother's shoulder, unsettled but unable to look away. The handler shifted, breaking the moment. He adjusted the leash and gave the shepherd a quiet pat behind the ears. The dog lowered its head again, resting its muzzle on its paws, seemingly content. But several jurors had noticed the exchange. One, a middle-aged woman in a floral blouse, scribbled a note furiously, her lips pursed tight. Another, a young man in a gray suit, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his gaze alternating between the dog and the child. The prosecution pressed forward with testimony, guiding the mother to describe events with as much detail as memory. Aloud, she recounted voices, movement, and the arrival of the K-9 unit. Her words faltered when she described the chaos that followed, the shouts, the confusion, the sudden appearance of the shepherd. She glanced down at her daughter, then, quickly away, as though the memory carried something too sharp to place in the open air. The defense attorney smirked faintly, sensing opportunity. He rose during cross-examination, circling like a patient predator. "So," he said, his voice dripping with practiced calm, "you're saying the dog entered the scene and everything became chaotic?" The woman hesitated, her grip tightening around her daughter. "Yes," there was shouting. "People were scared." The attorney nodded, feigning sympathy. "Understandable. But dogs, as we know, don't act independently. They respond to commands. Isn't it possible, ma'am, that your fear was not of the dog itself, but of the situation? Of the officers? Of the moment?" The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to say more, something truer, but the weight of the courtroom pressed down on her. The judge's gaze, the jury's pens scratching, the defendant's eyes boring into her, it all stifled her voice. She settled for a quiet, "Perhaps." The attorney smiled, satisfied enough, and returned to his seat. The jurors scribbled. Again, though more than one of them glanced back toward the shepherd, who had not moved a muscle. The dog's stillness became a character in its own right, shaping the atmosphere with its silence. Unlike the humans, it did not argue, did not posture. Its very lack of words gave it a power few could name. In its amber eyes lay an authority older than the law, older than the courthouse itself. It was the authority of instinct, of memory, of fear. During a short recess, as the courtroom emptied into the hallway, conversations flared in hushed tones. Some spoke of the witness's trembling voice, others of the defense attorney's sharp tactics. Yet woven into the chatter was always mention of the dog. "Did you see how it looked at her?" whispered one woman to her husband, like it knew something. The husband shook his head. "It's just a dog. Trained, sure, but still a dog." "Then why did the little girl stare at it like that?" The woman countered, her eyes wide. He had no answer. Inside, the shepherd remained, waiting with its handler. The courtroom was quieter now, but not empty. The dog's ears perked whenever the heavy doors swung open or closed. It tracked every footstep, every whisper. The handler leaned down once, whispering something into its ear. The shepherd's tail flicked once, a restrained signal of acknowledgement. The judge returned, gavel in hand, summoning order once more. The jurors shuffled back into place, their notebooks clasped tightly. The attorneys straightened their jackets, ready for the next round. A mother, still pale, carried her daughter back to the gallery. The toddler nestled against her shoulder, but her eyes wandered once again to the shepherd. She pointed a small finger toward it, though no words followed, at least not yet. The handler noticed the gesture, but said nothing. The dog remained unflinching. To most, it was simply an interlude, a moment of calm, before the next wave of testimony. But to those who watched closely, the quiet presence of the canine was more than background. It was a reminder that the trial wasn't merely about evidence or testimony. It was about perception, memory, and the unshakable weight of instinct. And as the proceedings rolled forward, building momentum towards something no one could yet see, the dog remained at the center, silent, waiting, watching. The courtroom had settled into its familiar rhythm. The steady cadence of questions and answers, the sharp interruptions of objections, the authoritative thud of the gavel when voices rose too far. For hours, the trial had unfolded like a slow burning play, each participant reciting their lines with varying conviction. Jurors scribbled, attorneys circled, witnesses faltered, and the crowd leaned forward, hungry for drama. But as the afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long beams of light across the polished wood, a subtle shift occurred. It began with a child's restlessness. The toddler, who had already defied expectations simply by being present, began to stir again. She had tolerated the weight of the courtroom for longer than anyone expected. Her stuffed rabbit had been hugged, twirled, and chewed upon until it seemed more frayed than ever. But boredom and curiosity are twin flames in children, and now they burned brightly in her. She squirmed in her mother's lap, wriggling against the stiff fabric of her dress. The mother whispered, "She, baby," smoothing her daughter's hair, but the little girl was no longer content to be still. Her gaze roamed the room, skipping past the lawyers' stern faces, past the jury's scribbling pens, past the judge's imposing figure. She was searching for something, though even she could not have said what. Her eyes stopped on the dog. The German shepherd was a dark, steady figure at the edge of the scene, its leash coiled neatly in the handler's hand. Most had grown used to the animal's silent presence, treating it as furniture that breathed. But to the child, the shepherd was different. It wasn't furniture. It wasn't a symbol. It was alive, watching, waiting. The girl tilted her head, her small mouth puckering in thought. For a moment, she hugged the rabbit tighter, as if weighing whether to keep her discovery to herself. Then, with the disarming bluntness only a toddler possesses, she stretched out her tiny arm. Her index finger extended, unwavering, pointing straight at the canine. The motion was simple, innocent, yet in that instant, the courtroom fractured. The mother gasped softly, startled by her daughter's sudden gesture. She tried to lower the child's arm, but the girl resisted, her little finger locked in determination. The jurors, caught off guard, glanced at one another before following the line of the child's finger to the shepherd. Even the attorneys paused mid-question, their voices faltering as the ripple of attention spread. A murmur traveled through the gallery. Heads turned, conversations hushed. It was as though the act of pointing something so ordinary in a child's world had pierced the rigid bubble of decorum and unleashed something raw. The handler stiffened. His grip tightened on the leash, though the dog had not moved. The shepherd merely lifted its head, ears twitching, eyes trained on the child with calm, unreadable focus. Its amber gaze met hers without flinching, holding her attention as surely as if it had spoken aloud. For several long seconds, nothing else existed. The attorney's notes, the judge's gavel, the defendant's blank stare all faded into background. The only thread of meaning in the room was the silent dialogue between the child and the dog. The judge shifted uneasily in his chair. He cleared his throat, intending to restore order, but found himself staring at the scene instead. His gavel remained still in his hand. Something about the moment felt untouchable, as if to interrupt it would be to sever a thread no one could. Quite name. The prosecutor looked back and forth between the child and the canine, her practiced composure slipping. She had rehearsed for every objection, every surprise witness, every last-minute defense tactic. But she had not rehearsed for this. A toddler, unprompted, commanding the attention of an entire courtroom with a single finger. The defense attorney, on the other hand, allowed a slow, wolfish smile to creep across his face. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, sensing the crack in the facade of order. Whatever came next, he knew, would be unpredictable. And unpredictability was a weapon he could wield. The mother shifted uncomfortably, her cheeks flushing under the weight of so many eyes. She whispered urgently, "Sweetheart, stop," tugging gently at her daughter's arm. But the girl remained stubborn. She kept pointing, eyes locked on the shepherd, as if she were the only one brave or innocent enough to name what everyone else felt, but dared not say. Time stretched. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the journalists, whose pens normally scratched feverishly at every syllable, hesitated, their hands hovering over their notepads. They, too, sensed the moment's strangeness, its weight. The shepherd, for its part, neither growled nor shifted. Its gaze was steady, calm, almost regal. But there was something unsettling about its stillness, as though it recognized the attention and accepted it without surprise. The child's voice broke the silence. Not yet words, not fully formed, just a small, determined sound to hum at. First, then a syllable, like a thought clawing its way into existence. The gallery leaned forward instinctively, though no one could explain why. The mother clutched her daughter tighter, but the girl would not relent. It was the pure unpredictability of it that rattled the room. Courtrooms thrive on order, on procedure, on the careful choreography of law. Every question and answer is scripted, every objection expected, every reaction monitored. Yet here was a toddler, untouched by the weight of law, tearing through that choreography with nothing more than a gesture. The judge finally raised his gavel. "Order," he said, though his voice lacked its usual iron. He struck the block once, the sharp crack breaking the trance. The jurors straightened, the attorneys shuffled their papers, and the gallery coughed back into chatter. The mother lowered her daughter's arm, whispering soothingly, desperate to contain the disruption. But the damage was already done. No one would remember the last few questions of testimony that day. They would not remember the technical details the prosecutor tried to salvage, or the objections the defense raised in response. What they would remember was the moment the child pointed at the K9, the sudden silence that followed, and the collective certainty that something beyond procedure had just brushed the edge of the trial. The shepherd lowered its head once more, as if retreating into its patient stillness. But its amber eyes flicked once toward the child before closing, a gesture too small for most to notice. The handler gave the leash a subtle tug, jaw tight, eyes forward. The trial moved on, as trials must. But the people in that room carried something new now, something heavy and intangible. The innocence of a child had opened a door no one had expected, and though it had closed again, everyone sensed it would not stay shut for long. For a long moment, the courtroom was a painting still, silent, every figure frozen in the posture they had assumed when the child's small finger rose to point. The mother's hand hovered uncertainly near her daughter's arm, torn between restraint and surrender. The prosecutor's lips were parted, mid-question, but no sound emerged. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, amusement flickering across his face like a candle's flame. Even the judge, so practiced in the art of composure, sat with his gavel raised but unmoving, as if unsure whether to bring it down or let the silence ring. And at the center of that silence stood the toddler, her cheeks flushed pink, her wide eyes locked on the German shepherd. The dog did not move. Its handler's grip tightened fractionally, knuckles whitening around the leash, but the shepherd remained statuesque, its amber gaze locked on the child with unnerving patience. It was as though the dog understood that it was the subject of something important, though not what. Then the child's lips parted. It was not a babble, not a half-formed sound. Her voice, small and high but startlingly clear, carried across the chamber with the precision of a bell. "Bad dog." The words were plain, unadorned, unmistakable. The effect was immediate. The mother gasped, clutching her daughter to her chest as though she could stuff the words back into her mouth. A murmur rose from the gallery, spreading quickly like a wave, punctuated by gasps and whispers. The jurors leaned forward, pens forgotten, their carefully cultivated neutrality shattering under the weight of the child's declaration. The defense attorney blinked once, his smirk vanishing into something sharper, more calculating. He had expected disruption. Yes, but not this. Not words so simple, so piercing, that they cut through the layers of legal argument like a knife through silk. He scribbled something furiously onto his legal pad, his eyes glittering. The prosecutor paled. For all her preparation, for all the evidence meticulously gathered and presented, she had not planned for this. She opened her mouth, perhaps to object, perhaps to reassure, but no sound came. How does one argue with innocence? How does one cross-examine a child too young to know the weight of her own words? The judge struck his gavel at last. Order. He barked, his voice firm, though not as steady as usual. This courtroom will maintain order, but the room refused to quiet. The words had already lodged themselves in every corner, echoing, impossible to unhear. The handler shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight. He avoided looking at the jurors, avoided the dog, avoided the child, as though stillness might erase the moment. The shepherd, however, held its composure. Its eyes, calm and unflinching, remained fixed on the little girl. If it understood the accusation, it betrayed nothing. The mother's eyes filled with tears. She stroked her daughter's hair frantically, whispering, "She, baby, she," though the child had fallen silent once more. The girl laid her head on her mother's shoulder, her small body relaxed, as though the act of speaking had lifted a burden only she could sense. But the burden had not lifted for anyone else. The jury shifted in their seats, the balance of the trial tilting invisibly, but undeniably. Some exchanged looks, silent questions flickering in their eyes. What did she mean? Why would she say that? Others stared at the shepherd, seeing it now not as a neutral presence, but as a character in the story, perhaps even a villain. A defense attorney seized the moment. Rising smoothly, he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I must object. This disruption is prejudicial. The jury cannot possibly ignore what they just heard." The prosecutor was quick to counter, though her voice carried strain. "The child is not a witness, Your Honor. She is incapable of giving testimony under oath. Her words are irrelevant to the proceedings." The judge rapped the gavel again. Both counsels will refrain from dramatics. The jury will disregard the outburst. It holds no bearing on the evidence presented. But even as he spoke, he knew his command was futile. He could order the jury to forget, but he could not unwrite the words etched into their minds. They would hear them tonight when they tried to sleep, tomorrow when they sat at breakfast, days from now when they deliberated. Bad dog. The gallery buzzed with whispers, the words repeating like an incantation, passed from mouth to mouth. Some shook their heads, dismissing it as childish nonsense. Others nodded knowingly, as though the toddler had simply confirmed what they already suspected. Reporters scribbled madly, each pen stroke another nail in the coffin of courtroom neutrality. Tomorrow's headlines were already forming. Toddler calls police K9, bad dog during trial. The defendant, who had sat like a stone for most of the day, stirred at last. His eyes flicked toward the child, then to the jury, and a faint glimmer of hope sparked in his expression. For the first time since the trial began, he allowed himself to imagine escape, not through evidence, but through perception, through the simple, damning words of a child. The mother looked mortified, though a trace of something else, fear, perhaps flickered behind her eyes. She rocked her daughter gently, whispering assurances neither of them fully believed. She had not told the girl to speak. She had not prepared her for this moment. Yet the child had spoken with conviction, as though she had seen something the rest of them were too blind or too unwilling to acknowledge. The judge eventually called a recess, his gavel striking hard enough to leave a dent in the wood. "This court will reconvene in 30 minutes, he announced, his voice gruff. "Jury, remember my instructions. You will disregard the disruption. It has no bearing on the matter at hand." The jurors filed out slowly, their expressions betraying nothing, but the tension in their movements spoke volumes. The gallery erupted the moment the doors opened, spilling into the hallway with a flurry of voices. Some laughed nervously, dismissing the child's words as coincidence. Others whispered theories in frantic tones, convinced the girl had revealed some hidden truth. Reporters clustered in tight groups, debating the headline that would best capture the shock of the moment. Inside, the courtroom emptied gradually, leaving behind only the handler, the dog, and the faint echo of the child's voice. The handler exhaled heavily, rubbing his temple before crouching to stroke the shepherd's head. The dog accepted the touch with calm detachment, its eyes half-lidded, untroubled. But the handler could not shake the words, "bad dog." He whispered them under his breath, testing their weight. They did not belong in this space, not in this trial, not directed at his partner. And yet they had been spoken innocently, unexpectedly, undeniably. He glanced toward the door where the mother and child had disappeared, then back at the shepherd. For the first time in years, doubt gnawed at him. Not doubt of the dog's training or loyalty, but doubt of perception, of memory, of the fragile line between truth and belief. The gavel had fallen, the court had recessed, and procedure would resume. But nothing could undo what had happened. 2 words had slipped past the walls of law and order, and now they echoed louder than any testimony, any evidence, any ruling. Bad dog. And in that echo, the trial shifted, forever. The courtroom, already thick with tension, seemed to contract, drawing every person into an invisible web spun by a child's 2 words, "bad dog." The syllables reverberated through the chamber, stubborn and persistent, refusing to fade even as the judge rapped his gavel for order. For some, the statement was amusing, a fleeting curiosity from an innocent mind. But for others, the attorneys, the jurors, even the officers who had worked alongside the K9, the words carried an unsettling weight. The mother, still holding her daughter close, felt a cold sweat prick at the back of her neck. She had not intended for her child to speak, much less speak something that could influence an entire trial. Her voice trembled as she whispered reassurances. "It's okay, baby. It's okay." But even she could not fully convince herself. The room had heard, and hearing it had changed everything. The jurors shifted in their seats, pens hovering above notebooks, though most found it impossible to write. Some exchanged uneasy glances. Their responsibility had been to weigh evidence, to assess testimony, to deliberate with impartiality. Yet now, human instinct had intruded. The sheer innocence of a child, untempered by context or understanding, had pierced the carefully constructed walls of logic they had been asked to maintain. The defense attorney saw opportunity in every flicker of doubt. Rising smoothly from his chair, he addressed the court with an uncharacteristic calm, his voice deliberate, almost theatrical. "Your Honor," he began, "I submit that this disruption is not mere childish nonsense. The jury has witnessed something unfiltered, an observation that carries more weight than procedural evidence. The perception of fear, the implication of guilt, these are now inseparable from the facts." The prosecutor's lips pressed into a thin line. She adjusted her notes repeatedly, though her hands shook ever so slightly. "Your Honor," she countered, "the child is not a witness, cannot comprehend the events she references, and is therefore irrelevant to the proceedings." The judge leaned back in his chair, weighing the arguments carefully. He rapped his gavel again, this time more forcefully. "Counselors, maintain decorum. The jury is instructed to disregard the statement. It is not evidence and has no bearing on the trial's outcome." But the words had already lodged themselves firmly in the minds of all present. Bad dog. Simple, yet unsettlingly powerful, they hung in the air like smoke, invisible yet unmistakable. Every adult present instinctively replayed the scene, scrutinizing the K-9 anew. Had the dog acted differently than they had thought? Was there more to the child's declaration than met the eye? The shepherd, obedient as ever, remained at the edge of the courtroom. Its amber eyes flicked occasionally toward the mother and child, then back to the handler. It had not moved when the child spoke. Yet even in its stillness, it projected presence and authority. The jurors could not help but notice it anew, considering its role in the events under scrutiny. Its silence was louder than any testimony given that day. Some jurors whispered to one another, careful to keep their voices low, though the tension in their tones betrayed them. "Did you hear that?" one asked, barely moving her lips. "The child. She said the dog was bad." "Do you think she—" another began, but hesitated, swallowing the thought before it could be spoken aloud. Others shook their heads, attempting to dismiss the moment. "It's a toddler, innocent, irrelevant." Yet no matter how firmly they repeated the mantra, the image lingered. A small finger pointing, eyes wide, judgment unclouded by understanding. That image refused to release its grip. The defense attorney leaned back, confident. He had spent months reviewing evidence, preparing arguments, and yet he knew that nothing he could present in a briefcase would carry the emotional force of the child's words. Human perception, raw and unfiltered, had now entered the equation. He had seen enough to know that the trial had subtly shifted. The momentum had changed direction without anyone noticing until the moment it was irreversible. The prosecutor struggled to regain her composure. She stood again, voice controlled but frayed at the edges. "Your Honor, while the court may instruct the jury to disregard the child's statement, we must acknowledge the potential for subconscious influence. It is the duty of this court to maintain impartiality, and the intrusion of extraneous factors, even innocent ones, cannot be ignored." The judge nodded solemnly, understanding the truth of her words. Yet he could do nothing beyond reiterating the instructions. Law relied on evidence, on procedure, on rules laid down to prevent exactly this kind of human error. But the human heart does not obey rules with the same mechanical precision. Meanwhile, the mother, still pale, rocked her daughter gently in her arms. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "It wasn't you? It's okay." She did not know whether she was reassuring the child or trying to convince herself. The toddler, meanwhile, remained silent, her attention elsewhere, momentarily lost in the folds of her stuffed rabbit. The innocence of the act had already achieved what legal arguments could not. It had shifted perceptions. The gallery murmured with speculation, reporters scribbling furiously. They had witnessed something unprecedented in a courtroom, something that would dominate the front pages and online feeds in the days to come. Yet even as they documented, they could not fully articulate the subtle terror, the quiet weight that the two words carried. The shepherd remained at the periphery of human awareness, calm and immovable. To those who watched it, there was a sense that it knew more than it should, that it understood its role in this unfolding drama with unnerving clarity. Its stillness became a mirror, reflecting the uncertainty now etched on every human face. In the room, as the trial resumed, each step forward was burdened with the shadow of what had occurred. Witnesses answered questions with careful precision. Attorneys presented evidence with methodical clarity, but beneath it all, the invisible tremor of the child's words rippled through the proceedings. Every movement, every glance, every moment of hesitation now carried additional weight. Even the defendant, previously stoic, felt the shift. His eyes flicked toward the jury, scanning for signs of doubt, for evidence that the human element, child's pure, unfiltered observation, had begun to undermine the structure of the prosecution's case. A faint, almost imperceptible hope crept into his expression. The jury, for their part, struggled to remain impartial. They had been instructed to disregard the toddler's words, yet their minds betrayed them. In the quiet moments between questions, they found themselves recalling the scene, the small finger, the unwavering gaze, the simple, damning declaration. Their subconscious interpretations mingled with the evidence, subtly altering their perceptions of the dog, the defendant, and the events of that night. The courtroom, once orderly and predictable, had acquired a new texture. Anxiety intermingled with curiosity. Fear mingled with fascination. And in the center of it all, the child's presence, innocent, unassuming, yet piercing, had introduced an element no legal brief, no objection, no instruction could erase. The day wore on, each new witness and each additional piece of evidence weighed against the silent judgment that had already been pronounced. The words "bad dog" echoed not audibly, but in every mind present, shaping interpretation, perception, and understanding. By the time the courtroom recessed for the evening, the impact was undeniable. Attorneys whispered in tight circles. Jurors reflected in hushed tones, and even the judge allowed himself a private sigh, knowing that the human element of bias and instinct had subtly, irrevocably intervened. Outside, the mother cradled her daughter, trying to explain the world in terms that the child might understand. "It's okay," she said softly, over and over. "It's just words. Nothing bad will happen." Yet inside, she felt the chilling weight of what had been spoken, understanding that the courtroom would not forget, that the ripple of innocence had already grown into something larger, something that could not be contained. And as night fell, over the courthouse and the streets beyond, the words lingered. Bad dog. Simple, innocent, terrifying in their clarity. They would echo in the halls, in the minds of jurors, in the strategies of attorneys, and in the unspoken fear that perhaps some truths were too raw for human order, too subtle to be governed by law, and too powerful to remain ignored. The courtroom had grown quieter than usual, yet beneath the stillness, tension thrummed like a live wire. Every pair of eyes seemed magnetically drawn to the space where the toddler had uttered her words. Bad dog. 2 words, simple yet devastating, had swept across the room, leaving every adult present scrambling to reorient themselves in a space that was supposed to operate on rules, logic, and procedure. The gallery buzzed with murmurs, some stifled, others outright, as people attempted to process what had happened. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching frantically across notepads, their instincts urging them to capture every nuance, every fleeting reaction. Yet even they could not fully grasp the strange gravity of the scene. A toddler, so young, had altered the flow of the trial simply by speaking. her innocence wielding more influence than any piece of paper, any sworn testimony, or any attorney's sharpest objection. Jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The judge's instructions to disregard the statement seemed to vanish into the air, ineffective against the human mind's natural tendency to remember striking, unusual moments. Even as they tried to focus on evidence, images of the child pointing, of her unwavering gaze and small but firm voice, pressed themselves into memory. Subtle doubts crept in. Doubts about the dog, doubts about the defendant, doubts about the stories that had been told. The defense attorney, sensing the subtle shift, allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. He had anticipated disruptions, unpredictable witnesses, the occasional unplanned hiccup, but he had not predicted anything like this. Now, though, the trial had changed. The momentum had shifted in ways that evidence alone could never achieve. His client's case had gained an unexpected edge, the human element, untethered from reason, operating in its purest, most persuasive form. Across the courtroom, the prosecutor struggled to regain composure. Her carefully rehearsed strategies seemed brittle now, incapable of withstanding the emotional tidal wave unleashed by a toddler. She tried to press forward with witness questioning, but her words felt hollow. Every time her gaze met the jury's, she caught the faint flicker of doubt, the momentary hesitation, the way their pens slowed, and she realized that the impact of a child's observation could outweigh the most meticulously prepared evidence. The defendant, for his part, sat rigidly, eyes flicking toward the gallery, toward the toddler and her mother, and then back at the jurors. He had spent weeks bracing for this trial, rehearsing his testimony, maintaining a controlled mask of stoicism. But now, hope had crept in. The trial, long framed in terms of guilt and evidence, had gained an unpredictable human dimension, one that favored perception over procedure, instinct over argument. The toddler herself was oblivious to the chaos she had set in motion. She sat quietly in her mother's lap, hugging her stuffed rabbit with renewed intensity, eyes scanning the room with curiosity rather than understanding. For her, it had been an exercise in observation, a spontaneous declaration of what she had seen. She had no concept of law, of guilt, of evidence, or of influence. Yet her words had done more than any expert witness could. They had struck at the emotional heart of everyone in the courtroom. Even the shepherd seemed aware of the subtle shift in atmosphere. Its ears twitched ever so slightly, head lifting, amber eyes tracking movement in the gallery. It had done its duty countless times, tracking, apprehending, signaling, but nothing in its training had prepared it for the subtle, intangible judgment cast by a child. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though the animal itself acknowledged the weight of the declaration, then, obedient as always, returned to its patient stillness. Whispers continued to ripple through the room. Some members of the public speculated about the child's intent. Others debated whether the moment had been accidental or prescient. "Did you see how she stared at the dog?" one whispered. "It's like she saw something no one else did." A mother seated near the back nodded, clutching her own child. "Children have intuition," she murmured. "They notice things adults overlook." A judge, acutely aware of the tension, tried to restore order, calling for silence multiple times. Each gavel strike reverberated through the chamber, but it felt increasingly like an attempt to assert control over something beyond authority. Human emotion had been stirred in ways the law could not govern. The next witness was called, but the courtroom's focus was fractured. Every gesture, every inflection, every look was filtered through the prism of the toddler's pronouncement. Even the lawyers noticed subtle hesitations, subtle recalibrations in responses, and unspoken glances exchanged across the aisle. The child's declaration had subtly rewritten a courtroom narrative. In recess, the whispers spilled into the hallways. Journalists crowded together, debating how to report the event. "It's incredible," one said, voice low. "A child influencing a trial. It's unprecedented." "Bad dog," muttered another, almost in disbelief. 2 words. That's all it took. The attorneys retreated to their private quarters, strategizing. The defense attorney smiled quietly, confident. He knew that this moment, once immortalized in testimony or even in media accounts, would color perception in a way that no argument could fully counteract. The prosecution, on the other hand, reviewed their notes frantically, trying to find a way to regain control over proceedings now dominated by the echo of a toddler's observation. Back in the courtroom, the jurors returned to their seats, still visibly unsettled. Their focus was split between procedure and memory, between instruction and instinct. They scribbled notes dutifully, yet their pens wavered. The trial, once a straightforward evaluation of facts, had become a theater where emotion and instinct intermingled dangerously with logic. The mother kept her daughter close, rocking her gently, whispering reassurances neither fully understood. For the child, the day had been a mixture of observation, quiet excitement, and minor boredom. Yet unknowingly, she had planted a seed that would grow through every witness, every piece of evidence, and every deliberation to come. Even the defendant felt the subtle shift. He had maintained composure, but now he recognized that the human element, the raw, unfiltered judgment of those around him, was at play in a way he could not have anticipated. The odds had subtly tilted, though it remained unclear by how much. The courtroom would remember this day not for the meticulous presentation of evidence, nor for the cross-examination of witnesses. It would be remembered for a small, unassuming figure, 2 words, and the ripple of perception they created. Bad dog. Simple, innocent, yet powerful beyond comprehension. By the time the day ended, the atmosphere in the courthouse was charged, brittle and almost tangible. Lawyers whispered in hushed tones about how to proceed. Jurors left the room in quiet contemplation, unable to shake the image of the child's finger pointing, the gaze unwavering, the words spoken with certainty. Reporters lingered, capturing the scene, preparing to share it with a world that would soon marvel at the intersection of innocence and authority. Even the shepherd, calm and obedient, seemed to sense that something had changed. Its eyes flicked occasionally toward the doorway through which the mother and child had disappeared. The handler, too, felt the tension in the room differently. Now, an undercurrent of uncertainty threading through every movement, every glance. The ripple effect had begun. The courtroom had been shaken not by evidence, not by argument, but by intuition filtered through innocence. And as night fell outside the courthouse, every mind that had witnessed the event carried with it a subtle, chilling awareness. The trial was no longer simply a matter of law. It had become a matter of perception. And perception, as the adults would discover, is a far more powerful force than anyone in that room had anticipated. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with a tension heavier than the previous day. The air felt charged, almost electric, as if every tile, every polished wooden bench, had absorbed the memory of 2 small words, and now pulsed with their residual. Wait. Reporters lined the hallways, their notepads poised, cameras focused, ready to capture any hint of drama. Even the security officers moved with an unusual alertness, sensing that something unprecedented was about to unfold inside the chamber. Inside, the courtroom seemed different. It wasn't the architecture, the judge, or the furniture that had changed. It was the atmosphere, a subtle, pervasive awareness that the previous day's events had altered everything. Every adult present carried the echo of Bad Dog in their minds. The jurors arrived first, filing into their seats with careful precision, yet there was an underlying tension in their posture, a restless shifting that betrayed the lingering impact of the toddlers. Declaration. The mother entered next, her daughter nestled against her shoulder. The little girl's eyes darted around the room, scanning faces and chairs, then paused on the German shepherd at the edge of the courtroom. Her small hand rose once more, not yet pointing, but tense, ready, alert. The shepherd's ears twitched, slightly, acknowledging the unspoken tension, though it remained obedient, its body still and controlled. The judge called the court to order, gavel striking sharply, but his voice carried a hint of strain. "Let us proceed," he said, though he could not entirely mask his awareness of the delicate, fragile energy that pervaded the room. The trial had shifted from procedural certainty to human perception, a space where instinct and innocence now carried more weight than rules or evidence. Witnesses were called, attorneys rose and fell, and testimony continued, but every sound, every movement, was filtered through the prism of the child's earlier words. "Bad dog." Each time the shepherd's amber eyes flicked toward the gallery, each time the jurors glanced at the child, the courtroom froze ever so slightly. Words were uttered, but their meaning seemed muted, altered by the subtle judgment cast. Across the room, by an untrained observer, a toddler, the defendant's eyes followed the girl, the realization dawning that his fate was now intertwined with her perception, her intuition. For weeks, he had worried only about the evidence, the witness statements, the forensic reports, the legal arguments. Now, none of that seemed sufficient to predict the outcome. A single unfiltered statement from a child had shifted the emotional landscape of the room. He adjusted his posture, hands folded, trying to appear unaffected, but even he could not hide the awareness of the extraordinary weight resting on those small shoulders. The defense attorney rose again, seizing the atmosphere like a weapon. His voice was measured but forceful, carrying a subtle implication that the court could not fully ignore. "Your Honor, the previous day's events have demonstrated something remarkable," he said, eyes flicking toward the toddler. "Perception matters. Observation matters. And in this case, the observation of one innocent mind may illuminate truths that procedural evidence alone cannot." The prosecutor's jaw tightened. She rose swiftly, papers in hand, attempting to reassert control over the proceedings. "Your Honor, the child's words, though spoken, are not evidence. They are not testimony. They cannot influence legal proceedings, and the court has instructed the jury to disregard them." The judge nodded, though his expression revealed the difficulty of the task. He rapped the gavel again, the sound echoing with authority, but the courtroom seemed almost suspended, caught in the gravity of the moment. Human perception, ungoverned by law or instruction, had gained a foothold in the room, and no gavel, no command, could erase it. Then the toddler moved. She lifted her small hand once more, trembling slightly, her eyes locked on the German shepherd. And in the hushed silence that followed, she spoke again, clear, precise, and unmistakable. "Bad dog." The courtroom froze as one. Every movement halted. Every breath seemed to suspend midair. The jurors' pens hovered above their notebooks mid-sentence. Attorneys paused mid-gesture, eyes widening. The judge's gavel remained suspended inches above the bench. Even the defendant, rigid in his seat, felt the world slow, as if time itself had been commanded to stop by two small words. It was not just the repetition that shocked. It was the certainty. The first time had been startling. The second time was undeniable. The child's tone carried conviction beyond her years, a clarity that rendered argument, evidence, and procedure almost irrelevant. The room collectively recognized it, the sheer truthfulness emanating from innocence, unfiltered and unwavering. The shepherd's ears flicked, its head lifting slightly as if acknowledging the statement. It remained obedient, calm, but every person in the room now perceived it differently. The dog, once a neutral presence, had been transformed into a character in the narrative of judgment, its role interpreted anew through the lens of perception rather than training. Whispers erupted across the gallery. Some shook their heads, trying to dismiss what had happened. Others leaned forward, drawn to the clarity of the moment. Reporters scribbled furiously, the rhythm of their pens a frantic attempt to capture the scene, knowing that what they were witnessing would dominate headlines for weeks. The jurors, though instructed repeatedly to disregard the statement, could not. Human perception is stubborn, ungoverned by instruction. They could not erase the child's voice from memory, nor could they ignore the force of observation delivered without bias or guile. The trial, once a measured and orderly affair, had become something fluid, unpredictable, and deeply human. The defense attorney allowed himself a brief, satisfied smile. He knew the case had shifted. Evidence, he realized, would now be filtered through perception. Witness testimony would carry the weight of human interpretation, forever colored by the small, damning voice that had so clearly spoken. The scales of judgment, once balanced on paper, had been tilted by instinct, intuition, and the clarity of innocence. The prosecutor struggled to regain control. She attempted to redirect the jurors' attention to procedural details, to forensic evidence, to the facts presented, but her words were met with subtle resistance. The minds she sought to guide were no longer fully hers to command. The child's repetition had carved a channel through which perception flowed, and it could not be closed. Even the judge allowed a private sigh, recognizing the truth. The courtroom had been altered. Authority, procedure, and logic could not erase the impact of unfiltered observation. The child, entirely unaware of the influence she wielded, had become the axis around which the trial now turned. As proceedings continued, the energy remained taut, almost palpable. Each witness approached the stand with a new awareness. Each question carried additional weight, and each glance at the gallery reminded everyone present that perception, innocence, and instinct had taken precedence over every formal instruction. When the day finally ended and the gallery emptied into the hallways, the impact of the toddler's words lingered. Attorneys whispered strategies in tight clusters. Jurors discussed what they could privately, and reporters prepared to share the extraordinary events with the world. Outside, the mother held her daughter close, gently rocking her, whispering soft reassurances. For the toddler, it had been a day of observation and occasional boredom, yet she had unknowingly shaped the outcome of an entire trial. Even the shepherd, calm and patient, seemed to sense a change. Its amber eyes flicked one last time toward the child, acknowledging the invisible judgment cast by innocence. The handler exhaled heavily, gripping the leash with a mix of respect and apprehension, aware that the courtroom's equilibrium had shifted in ways that could not be undone. 2 words had frozen the courtroom, repeated twice, delivered with the authority of unfiltered perception. They had altered jurors' minds, colored attorneys' strategies, and transformed a neutral presence into a character in the narrative of judgment. The trial would continue, evidence would be heard, and verdicts would be considered, but nothing would ever be the same. The courtroom had witnessed something extraordinary, a collision of innocence and authority, perception and law. And as the sun set outside the courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished floor, the memory of the toddler's declaration lingered in every mind present. Bad dog. Simple, innocent, irrevocably powerful.